Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the dusty, sun-baked corners of the American West. But we're not looking for the heroic gunslingers or the stoic sheriffs that Hollywood has sold us for generations. We're going deeper. We're looking for the strange, the bizarre, and the downright baffling things that ordinary people did just to get by. These aren't the stories you'll find in blockbuster movies. They are the quiet, peculiar, and often unsettling truths of a world where survival demanded a different kind of logic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm always curious to see our global community, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to uncover the strange, forgotten habits of the Wild West, and you'll soon see that the truth was far weirder than any fiction. Congratulations, you've arrived in the American West of the 1880s. The air is thin, the sun is relentless, and the rules of polite society you once knew have been replaced by a much rawer, more practical code of conduct. The strangeness of this new world begins not in the saloons or on the range, but with the very vessel you inhabit, your own body. How you cared for it, what you put on it, and what you believed about it would seem utterly bizarre to modern eyes. But here, it was simply the art of staying alive. Let's start with the most fundamental aspect of your daily existence: hygiene. Or, more accurately, the profound and widely accepted lack of it. You might think of the frontier as a place of rugged cleanliness, of cowboys washing up in clear streams. The reality was far smellier. Imagine you've just finished a 14-hour day of back-breaking labor, mending fences, hauling water, or maybe just trying not to get kicked by a mule. You're caked in a fine layer of dust, sweat, and whatever else the wind decided to throw at you. Your first instinct, conditioned by a lifetime of modern convenience, would be to jump into a long, hot shower. Here, that instinct is a fantasy. Bathing wasn't a daily ritual. It wasn't even a weekly one. For many settlers, a full-body wash was a monthly or even seasonal event. It was a major undertaking that required hauling and heating gallons of precious water, a resource too valuable to be wasted on mere cleanliness. When the time finally came for the great family bath, it was a communal affair, but not in a fun spa day sort of way. A large wooden or metal tub would be placed near the hearth, the only source of heat in your small cabin. Water would be laboriously heated over the fire, pail by pail. The first person to use this gloriously warm water was, by custom, the man of the house. He'd have his soak, emerging slightly less grimy than before. Then, without changing the water, the other men and boys of the household would take their turns. After them, the women would use the same water, starting with the mother and ending with the youngest girls. Finally, if there was any warmth left in the now murky, soap-scummed, lukewarm liquid, the babies would be last. By the end of it, the final bather was likely emerging dirtier than they went in. This wasn't seen as disgusting, it was seen as efficient. And what of soap? You didn't just buy a bar at the general store. Soap making was a foul, dangerous, and time-consuming process. It involved saving animal fat and grease from cooking for months until you had a rancid collection. Then, you'd create lye, a highly caustic chemical, by pouring water through a barrel of hardwood ashes. The dark, oily liquid that dripped out was lye. This lye was then boiled with the animal fat for hours over an open fire, a stinking, sputtering process that could result in severe chemical burns if a single drop splashed on you. The resulting soap was a harsh, brown, greasy substance that could strip the paint from a barn door. It was used for laundry, for scrubbing floors, but rarely for skin, as it would leave you red, raw, and irritated. So, between the scarcity of water and the harshness of soap, the path of least resistance was clear: don't bathe. But what about the days in between? A quick splash of cold water on the face and hands in the morning was the standard. For the rest of your body, you simply let the layers of dust and sweat accumulate. And this is where we encounter the first truly strange practice: the tactical use of grime. Many frontier folk, consciously or not, understood that a layer of dirt and natural body oil could act as a crude insulator against both the biting winter wind and the scorching summer sun. It also offered a bizarre form of protection against the legions of insects, fleas, lice, and chiggers that were a constant part of life. A clean, fresh body was an open invitation. A seasoned, grimy one was a less appealing target. The constant battle with pests was a fact of life. Your straw-stuffed mattress was a thriving metropolis for bedbugs. Your hair and clothes were prime real estate for body lice. Cures were strange and ineffective. To combat bedbugs, people might rub their wooden bed frames with kerosene or a mixture of turpentine and lard, filling their sleeping space with flammable, noxious fumes. For body lice, a common, if horrifying, treatment was to rub a mercury-based ointment into the skin, slowly poisoning yourself to kill the pests. So, that pervasive body odor you notice hanging in the air of every cabin, every general store, every saloon, it wasn't a sign of failure, it was the scent of survival. People grew so accustomed to it that they likely didn't even notice it, much like we grow nose-blind to the scent of our own homes. To arrive in town smelling freshly of soap might have marked you not as clean, but as a newcomer, a greenhorn, someone who didn't yet understand how things worked out here. The strangeness extended to laundry. Washing clothes was an equally monumental task, often done in a nearby creek by beating the garments against a rock with a paddle. In winter, this was impossible. Clothes were worn for weeks, even months, on end. That stiff, scratchy feeling of your denim pants wasn't from the fabric alone, it was from the accumulated layers of dirt, grease, and sweat that had essentially become a second skin. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also warm. In a world without thermal underwear, a well-soiled set of clothes was the next best thing. You didn't just wear your clothes, you seasoned them. Now that you're accustomed to the communal aroma of the frontier, let's talk about smiling. You might hesitate to show your teeth, and for good reason. Dental hygiene in the Wild West was a landscape of horrors, a place where pain was a constant companion, and the solutions were often worse than the problem. Imagine waking up with a throbbing toothache. Not a mild sensitivity, but a deep, pulsing agony that radiates through your jaw and makes it impossible to think. In your modern life, you'd call a dentist and get an appointment. Here, your options are grimly limited. The concept of a dedicated dentist was a rarity, a luxury for the wealthy in large eastern cities. On the frontier, your dental needs were typically handled by the local barber. Yes, the same person who just gave your neighbor a rough shave with a straight razor was now your go-to guy for oral surgery. These barber surgeons were jacks of all trades, skilled in cutting hair, lancing boils, letting blood, and of course yanking teeth. You'd sit in a rickety chair, perhaps in the corner of a saloon or in the barber's own dusty shop. There would be no sterile equipment, no gentle numbing injections. Your anesthetic was a generous swig of whiskey, meant more to steady the barber's hand than to ease your pain. The tool of choice was a terrifying piece of iron called a tooth key. It was a metal rod with a claw at the end that was designed to hook around the offending tooth. The barber would fit the claw, grip the handle, and then turn it, like a key in a rusty lock, until the tooth either broke free from the jaw or shattered into agonizing fragments. The sound of the root cracking, the grinding of bone, would be something you'd never forget. Other tools included brutal-looking forceps called pelicans for their beak, like shape, or simple pliers borrowed from a blacksmith's forge. If you were lucky, the whole tooth came out. If not, you were left with a shattered root, an open wound, and a high likelihood of a life-threatening infection. Given these options, most people simply endured. They tried folk remedies first. A common treatment was to pack the cavity with a wad of cotton soaked in clove oil or laudanum, an opium tincture. This provided temporary, narcotic relief, but did nothing to solve the underlying problem. Some believed that toothaches were caused by a tooth worm burrowing into the nerve, and bizarre rituals were performed to coax the worm out, such as inhaling the smoke from burning henbane seeds. Eventually, the pain became unbearable, or the tooth simply fell out on its own. By the time a person reached their 30s, it was common to have a mouth full of blackened stumps and empty gaps. This wasn't seen as a sign of poor health. It was just a feature of getting older. False teeth existed, but were for the very wealthy. The most famous set belonged to George Washington. But on the frontier, you were more likely to see someone with a single, crudely carved wooden tooth tied into place with wire, more for appearance than function. What about prevention? Toothbrushes existed but were an uncommon luxury, often made with boar bristles that were stiff and abrasive. Toothpaste was a homemade affair, a paste made from things like soot, chalk, salt, or crushed charcoal. Some people chewed on twigs from specific trees, like sassafras, which had some antiseptic properties. Others simply swished their mouths with whiskey or salt water and hoped for the best. The diet didn't help. While sugar was less common, the food was tough and gritty. Hardtack biscuits, dried meats, and stone-ground flour that often contained literal bits of stone wore down enamel at an alarming rate. Perhaps the strangest social aspect of this was the complete lack of stigma. In a world where everyone's teeth were in some state of decay, a perfect smile would have been the truly strange sight. People spoke, laughed, and courted without the self-consciousness that plagues modern society. Your value wasn't in your pearly whites, but in your ability to rope a steer, raise a crop, or survive a winter. Your smile might be broken, but as long as your spirit wasn't, you fit right in. If a toothache was a nightmare, a more serious illness or injury was a potential death sentence. Medicine in the Wild West was a bewildering landscape of folk remedies, dangerous theories, and unabashed quackery. Your local doctor, if you were lucky enough to have one, likely had minimal formal training and operated on principles that were centuries out of date. Let's say you come down with a high fever. You're delirious, sweating and weak. The doctor arrives, his bag filled not with antibiotics and sterile instruments, but with lancets, jars of leeches, and potent purgatives. This was the era of heroic medicine, a philosophy that believed the body needed to be violently shocked back into balance. The diagnosis for almost any ailment from fever to indigestion to melancholy was an imbalance of your four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cure? Removing the excess humour. Your doctor would likely prescribe bloodletting. He'd make an incision in your arm with a lancet and drain a pint or two of your blood into a bowl, believing he was removing the feverish blood. In reality, he was just weakening you further, making you more susceptible to whatever illness you were fighting. If bloodletting didn't work, the next step was purging. You'd be given a powerful emetic to make you vomit or a laxative, often containing toxic substances like calomel, mercury chloride, or arsenic, to violently cleanse your bowels. The theory was to expel the sickness from your body. The result was usually severe dehydration and further weakening of your system. You might survive the illness, but you'd first have to survive the cure. Surgery was a terrifying last resort, performed on kitchen tables without anesthesia or sterilization. A serious leg fracture often meant amputation. You'd be held down by several strong men, given a bottle of whiskey to bite down on, and the surgeon would go to work with a bone saw. The speed of the surgeon was his greatest asset, as a prolonged procedure meant unbearable agony. Post-operative infection, or blood poisoning, was so common that it was often the infection, not the initial injury, that proved fatal. In the absence of reliable doctors, people turned to a world of strange and wonderful folk remedies. A common cure for a cough was a syrup made of molasses and onions. To cure a fever, some people would wear a necklace of dried mole's feet. For rheumatism, you might be advised to carry a raw potato in your pocket until it turned hard and black, supposedly absorbing the disease from your body. Another popular practice was to tie a piece of salted pork around a sore throat. It was believed the salt drew out the inflammation, though it more likely just made you smell like a side of bacon. This environment was a paradise for one of the West's most iconic figures, the snake oil salesman. These travelling doctors would roll into town in colourful wagons, putting on elaborate medicine shows to draw a crowd. They'd entertain with music, magic tricks, and tall tales before launching into a sales pitch for their miracle tonic. These tonics, with names like Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root or Kickapoo Indian Sagwa, claimed to cure everything from baldness to cancer. What was in these miracle cures? Mostly alcohol and opium. Some contained cocaine, caffeine, or other narcotics. They didn't cure anything, of course, but they made you feel better temporarily. A swig of a high-proof, opium-laced tonic could certainly take the edge off a toothache or a bout of nervous exhaustion. Many respectable citizens, particularly women who were discouraged from drinking alcohol publicly, became unwitting addicts, relying on their daily dose of medicine to get through the day. Buying a bottle of this quack medicine wasn't just a transaction, it was an act of hope, in a world where real medical help was scarce, and often terrifyingly brutal. In the 19th century, hair was more than just hair. It was a powerful symbol, a medium for expressing identity, status, and, most strangely, grief. The ways people groomed, styled, and even used their hair reveal a world of forgotten customs. For men, the era was a golden age of facial hair. A clean-shaven face was often associated with youth, clergy, or dandies. A real man, a man of substance on the frontier, wore his masculinity on his face. But this wasn't just a simple beard. There was a complex and often bizarre vocabulary of styles. You had the mutton chops, thick patches of hair on the cheeks connected to a mustache, while the chin remained bare. You had the walrus, a thick, drooping mustache that covered the mouth. You had the Shenandoah, a full beard with no mustache at all. Maintaining these elaborate creations was a ritual. Men used special waxes and pomades, often made from bear grease, to shape and style their facial hair. They owned specialized combs and brushes. A man's facial hair was a statement. A reflection of his personality. Was he rugged, distinguished, or flamboyant? This grooming obsession stood in stark contrast to the general lack of bodily hygiene. You might not have bathed in a month, but your mustache was impeccably waxed. For women, the customs surrounding hair were even more intimate and, to our eyes, profoundly strange. While a woman's hair was her crowning glory, often worn in intricate updos, its most significant role came after death. This was the era of hair work. Imagine your beloved sister has passed away. In a time before photographs were common or affordable, you would want a tangible memento to remember her by. You would carefully snip a lock of her hair before she was buried. This lock of hair was not just to be kept in a locket. It would be used to create a piece of art. This was a highly skilled craft, practiced mostly by women. The hair would be cleaned, sorted, and then woven into intricate patterns. It could be fashioned into a brooch, a ring, or a watch fob. A common design was a weeping willow tree, its delicate branches made from fine strands of hair. Flowers, wreaths, and abstract patterns were also popular. These were not seen as morbid. They were deeply sentimental and fashionable pieces of jewelry. A woman might wear a brooch containing the hair of her deceased mother, father, and siblings, a tangible connection to her lost family. The craft extended beyond jewelry. Larger, more elaborate pieces of hair art were created to be displayed in the home. Entire family trees could be rendered in hair, with wreaths and bouquets made from the blended locks of multiple generations, living and dead. These framed artworks, often sitting on the parlor mantel, were a family's literal, physical history. This practice reveals a relationship with death that is alien to us. The physical remains of a loved one were not something to be shied away from, but to be cherished, touched, and integrated into daily life. Wearing a piece of your dead grandmother's hair on your lapel was a beautiful act of remembrance, not a macabre curiosity. It was a way of keeping the dead close, of refusing to let them disappear completely in a world where life was so fragile and loss so common. Life in the West wasn't just physically demanding, it was socially bewildering. The rules of etiquette you might have known back east were either forgotten or twisted into new and peculiar forms. How you spoke, how you courted, how you grieved, and how you settled disputes was governed by an unwritten code that valued practicality over politeness and survival over sentimentality. Romance on the frontier was a complicated dance, a mix of stark pragmatism and surprisingly sentimental, if strange, rituals. With a significant gender imbalance in many areas, men often vastly outnumbered women. Finding a partner was a serious business. Let's imagine you're a young man looking for a wife. You might attend a town dance, a rare and cherished social event. Here, the etiquette was strict. You couldn't just approach a woman. You had to be formally introduced. At the dance, you might ask her to write her name on your dance card, a small booklet where she would reserve specific dances for specific suitors. It was a formal, almost contractual approach to flirtation. But what if there were no eligible women in your town? You might turn to one of the West's most famous and misunderstood institutions, the mail-order bride. You would place an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper or a matrimonial circular, describing yourself and the kind of partner you were seeking. Homesteader, 35, sober and hard-working, seeks a woman of good character, owns 160 acres and a sturdy mule. Object, matrimony. Women back east, perhaps seeking adventure, escaping poverty, or simply wanting a husband, would respond with letters. A correspondence would begin, a courtship conducted entirely through ink and paper over thousands of miles. You'd exchange photographs, dreams, and practical questions. After weeks or months, if both parties agreed, the woman would embark on the long, arduous journey west to marry a man she had never met. It was an incredible gamble for both parties. a relationship built on trust and a handful of letters. Sometimes it led to lifelong happiness. Other times, it ended in disaster, with one party not being what they seemed, or the harsh reality of frontier life proving too much. Even when love was local, its expression could be strange. The sweet, flowery sentiments of Victorian poetry were popular, but so was a bizarre and forgotten tradition, the vinegar valentine. These were the complete opposite of a love letter. They were cards, often crudely illustrated, sent anonymously to someone you disliked. They featured caricatures and insulting poems, mocking the recipient for being too vain, too skinny, too loud, or for having a bad reputation. Your face is a sight that would scare a dog, you clumsy, ugly, lazy log. It was a socially acceptable way to vent frustrations, issue a public shaming, or engage in a bit of cruel humour in a society with few outlets for such things. Receiving one was a public humiliation. Perhaps one of the strangest courtship rituals was the practice of bundling, a tradition that migrated from New England to parts of the frontier. When a young man came to call on a woman, and the hour grew late, he might be invited to stay the night. To conserve heat and firewood, he would be invited to sleep in the same bed as the young woman. However, to ensure propriety, they would be bundled. This meant they were either sewn into separate sleeping sacks, or a bundling board, a long plank of wood, was placed down the middle of the bed to separate them. It was a practice born of pure practicality, a way to allow courtship to continue without wasting precious resources or forcing the suitor to make a long, dangerous journey home in the dark. It rested entirely on the honour of the couple, a strange mix of intimacy and enforced distance that perfectly captured the contradictory nature of frontier life. In our modern world, we have pushed death to the sterile, quiet margins of life. It is an event that happens behind the closed doors of hospitals and is managed by professionals in hushed funeral homes. It is an abstraction, something we see on screens but rarely touch, rarely smell, rarely witness in its raw, unedited reality. But we are going back to a time when death was not on the margin. It was at the very centre of family life. It was an intimate, domestic, and frequent visitor. In the 19th century, death happened in the home. It unfolded in the same bed where you were born, in the same room where the family gathered. The line between the living and the dead was thin, and people developed a complex, deeply personal, and, to our eyes, profoundly strange set of rituals to navigate that porous border. These practices were not born of a ghoulish obsession, but from two fundamental human impulses: the desperate need to hold on to those they had lost, and the primal, terrifying fear of the grave itself. The last vigil. Imagine the scene, a common tragedy in any town. Your youngest child, a daughter of 5, has succumbed to diphtheria. The past week has been a helpless agony, watching the grey, leathery membrane grow in her throat, listening to her breathing become a ragged, painful struggle. The doctor, with his limited tools and useless tonics, could do nothing. The end comes not with a dramatic bang, but with a final, quiet exhalation. The tortured rasping stops, and the silence that floods the room is more deafening and terrible than any sound. The grief is a physical force, a weight that presses down on your chest, stealing the air from your own lungs. But there is no time to collapse. There are things that must be done, and they must be done by you. The women of the house, your wife, your mother, your sisters now begin the sacred and sorrowful task of laying out the body. This is the first great departure from our modern experience. There is no call to a funeral home. You will not hand your loved one over to a stranger. It is you who will perform the last acts of care. With gentle hands, you wash your child's small body for the final time. You comb her hair. You select her favourite Sunday dress, the one she loved most, and carefully clothe her limp form. The most difficult task is closing the eyes, which often refuse to stay shut. You might have to place small coins, cool against the still warm skin, upon the eyelids to weigh them down, a practice ancient and resonant. Once prepared, the body is not hidden away. It is brought to the most important room in the house, the parlour. This room, normally reserved for honoured guests, now becomes a temporary shrine. The child is laid out on a sofa, or perhaps in her own small bed, surrounded by flowers brought by neighbours. Their sweet, cloying scent mixes with the faint, unmistakable, and slightly metallic smell of death, a perfume of sorrow that will linger in the house for weeks. For the next 2 or 3 days, a vigil is kept. The family sits with the body around the clock, a constant, quiet presence. Friends and neighbours come to call. They don't offer platitudes or shrink away. They enter the parlour, sit for a while, perhaps touch the child's cold hand, and share stories. They bring food, taking over the practical needs of the household so the immediate family can simply be present in their grief. This is a communal sorrow. The entire community bears its breast to the blow, absorbing some of the impact. The funeral is an important ritual, but this period of the wake, of living side by side with the dead, is the true heart of the grieving process. The paper ghost. In the midst of this profound sorrow, you make a decision that seems utterly alien to us. You summon the town's photographer. He is not coming to document the funeral. He is coming to take one last portrait of your deceased child. This is the practice of post-mortem photography, and it is born from a desperation we can barely comprehend. In our world, our phones and computers are overflowing with thousands of digital images of our loved ones. We can capture every birthday, every holiday, every mundane moment. But in the mid-19th century, photography was a rare, expensive, and cumbersome affair. It's entirely possible that your family, like many others, did not possess a single photograph of the child you have just lost. Her image exists only in your memory, an image you know will fade and blur with the passing years. The post-mortem photograph is your one and only chance to defy time, to capture her likeness and hold it fast against the erosion of memory. It is an act of ferocious love. The photographer's arrival is a strange intrusion. He is a man of science and art, part technician, part mortician. He brings with him his heavy wooden camera, his tripod, his polished lenses, and a box of fragile glass plates. The air fills with the sharp, chemical smell of collodion and silver nitrate. The process is slow and deliberate. The goal is not to create a ghoulish image, but a peaceful and beautiful one. You want to remember your child as if she were merely sleeping. She is posed with painstaking care. Her head is propped up on a pillow. Her favourite doll might be placed in her arms. But the body, in the grip of rigor mortis, is not always cooperative. The photographer might have to use a hidden metal stand, a brace that runs up the back of the dress, to keep the child sitting upright in a chair. In some of the most haunting of these images, the photographer's artifice extends to the eyes, which might be propped open to simulate life, though they remain empty of its spark. The most heartbreaking portraits are those that include the living. You, the grieving family, gather around your lost child for one final family portrait. A mother holds her deceased infant in her lap, her arms wrapped around a cold, still form, her face a mask of sorrow as she stares into the camera's unblinking eye. Siblings are arranged around the chair where their lost brother or sister sits. Their faces a mixture of confusion and grief. Everyone must remain perfectly still for the long exposure time, which can last for many seconds, even up to a minute, and this is where the haunting quality of these images is born. The deceased, in their absolute stillness, are captured with a perfect, preternatural clarity. But the living, the breathing, swaying, blinking family members often appear as a slight blur, their grief-stricken forms literally less substantial than the sharp, clear image of the dead. It is a photograph of a ghost surrounded by fading mortals. This small, precious image on glass or tin, kept in a velvet-lined case, will become your most treasured possession, a paper tombstone, a tangible connection to the child you can no longer hold. The uniform of sorrow. Once the funeral is over and the body is committed to the earth, the performance of grief begins. Mourning in the Victorian era was not just an emotion. It was a complex and highly ritualized social duty, and its burdens fell almost entirely on women. For you, the man of the house, mourning is a subtle and temporary affair. You might wear a simple black armband for a few months. You might put a black band around your hat. But you are expected to continue with your work, to engage in society, to be the rock upon which the family stands. You are permitted, even encouraged, to move on. For your wife, however, grief is a uniform she must wear, a sentence she must serve. As a widow, she is expected to enter a period of deep mourning that can last a year and a day, or even longer. Her entire wardrobe must be black. Not just any black, but a specific, non-reflective, lusterless black. She wears dresses made of heavy, scratchy fabrics like bombazine or parramatta, trimmed in dull, black crepe. The crepe itself was known to be uncomfortable, its dye sometimes running and irritating the skin, a constant physical reminder of her inner pain. She wears a black bonnet with a long black veil. Her gloves are black. Her handkerchief is edged in black. She is a figure shrouded in darkness, a walking symbol of her loss. Her social life ceases to exist. She is forbidden from attending parties, balls, weddings, or any happy social gathering. To do so would be a sign of profound disrespect to her husband's memory. She is to live a life of quiet seclusion, receiving only close family and other mourners. After the first year, she might be permitted to enter second mourning, where she can shed the oppressive crepe and introduce fabrics with a slight sheen like silk or taffeta. After another 6 months to a year, she might graduate to half mourning, where colours like grey, lavender, mauve, and white are slowly allowed back into her wardrobe. This complex and rigid set of rules was a coded language of sorrow, understood by everyone. It dictated the width of the black trim on a calling card, the type of jewellery that was permissible, jet, onyx, or jewellery woven from the hair of the deceased, and the duration of mourning for different relatives. The death of a child or a parent required a shorter, less severe period of mourning than that for a husband. It was a hierarchy of grief, publicly displayed for all to see. For a woman, her sorrow became her identity. The terror in the dark. Beneath all these formal rituals of remembrance and grief lay a deeper, more primal fear, an anxiety that gnawed at the heart of the 19th century psyche, the terror of being buried alive. This was not an irrational fantasy. It was a fear grounded in the limitations of their medical science. In an age before stethoscopes, EKGs, and modern neurological exams, how could one be absolutely, 100% certain that a person was dead? Comas, catalepsy, deep fainting spells, or even a severe stroke could produce a state that was indistinguishable from death. The body would be cold, the breath shallow or imperceptible, the pulse faint or undetectable. The newspapers and popular fiction of the day, most famously by writers like Edgar Allan Poe, were filled with sensational, terrifying tales of people waking up in the darkness of their own coffins, their screams muffled by 6 feet of earth. This collective anxiety became a cultural obsession, leading to the invention of one of the most morbidly fascinating creations of the era, the safety coffin. These were coffins designed with escape hatches for the prematurely interred. The patterns and designs were varied and ingenious. Some had a bell on the surface, with a rope that ran down through the coffin lid and was placed in the hand of the corpse. The slightest movement would, in theory, ring the bell and alert a cemetery watchman. Others were equipped with elaborate systems of levers and pulleys connected to a raised flag or a pyrotechnic signal. Some designs featured speaking tubes, allowing the deceased to shout for help, or small glass windows over the face to allow an observer to check for signs of life. While there is little to no evidence that these safety coffins ever actually saved anyone, their popularity speaks volumes about the very real and pervasive fear of the grave. People took matters into their own hands, writing specific and gruesome instructions into their wills. They would request that their jugular vein or a major artery be severed before the coffin lid was sealed, ensuring a quick and final death should they still be alive. They would demand a waiting period of several days before burial, or insist that a doctor perform one last check, holding a cold mirror to the lips to check for the faint mist of breath. In a world defined by uncertainty, where diseases could strike without warning and medical science offered few answers, the finality of death was the one thing people desperately wanted to be sure of. Their elaborate rituals, their haunting photographs, and their morbid inventions were all part of a profound human struggle. To find meaning in loss, to preserve memory against oblivion, and to build a final, desperate defense against the terrifying possibility of waking up in the dark. The saloon is perhaps the most iconic institution of the Wild West, a place romanticized in countless films as a den of brawling cowboys, cheating card sharps, and dramatic gunfights. While violence certainly occurred, the daily life of the saloon was governed by a set of strange and unspoken rules that were just as important as the law of the land. Picture yourself pushing through the swinging doors. The air inside is thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and thick tobacco smoke. It's a man's world, and the first rule is that you leave your judgment at the door. A man's past was his own business. You didn't ask personal questions. The man drinking next to you could be a failed farmer, a disgraced doctor, or a wanted outlaw. As long as he paid for his drinks and didn't cause trouble, he was welcome. The etiquette of drinking was surprisingly formal. You never poured your own drink from a bottle sitting on the bar. The bartender did that. It was considered polite to buy a round for those you were speaking with, and they were expected to reciprocate. Refusing a drink offered to you could be seen as a serious insult. One of the strangest features of many saloons was the free lunch. This wasn't an act of charity. On a table at the back, you'd find a spread of food: crackers, cheese, pickled eggs, sausages, and perhaps some bread. The catch? The food was incredibly salty. The saloon owner wasn't trying to be generous. He was trying to make you thirsty. The saltier the free food, the more beer and whiskey you'd buy to wash it down. It was a brilliant, if deceptive, business model. Now, let's talk about that whiskey. The liquid sloshed into your glass was often a vile concoction known as tarantula juice or coffin varnish. It was rarely the aged, smooth bourbon you see in movies. It was often raw alcohol, diluted with water, and then flavoured with anything the bartender had on hand to give it colour and kick. Common additives included tobacco spit for colour, chili peppers or gunpowder for bite, and even turpentine or strychnine for an extra jolt. A single drink could be a gamble with your health. The phrase, "name your poison," was often quite literal. Spitting was a common, almost artistic pastime. Every saloon had brass spittoons or gaboons placed strategically on the floor. Hitting one from a distance with a stream of tobacco juice was a mark of skill. Missing it was a common occurrence, and the floors were often a sticky, stained mess. And what about women? Respectable women did not enter saloons. The only women you'd typically find inside were the soiled doves, or painted ladies, prostitutes and dancehall girls. They operated under their own set of rules, often working in partnership with the saloon owner. They were a vital part of the saloon's economy, but they occupied a precarious social space, simultaneously desired and ostracized. The saloon wasn't just a place for drinking and vice. It was the town's social center. It was where you got your mail, heard the news, made business deals, held informal court sessions, and even voted in elections. It was the living room of the community, a place that was simultaneously dangerous and essential, governed by a strange mix of formal etiquette and the constant, simmering threat of chaos. The West is famous for being lawless, but that isn't entirely true. It had laws, but they were often strange, unevenly enforced, and supplemented by a brutal, informal code of justice that operated outside any courtroom. One of the most bizarre and cruel legal trends to emerge in the late 19th century were the so-called ugly laws, beginning in cities like Chicago and San Francisco, and spreading to towns across the West. These were municipal ordinances that made it illegal for any person who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object to appear in public. Imagine that. If you had a visible disability, a severe burn, or a condition that made you look different, you could be fined or jailed simply for being seen on the street. It was a harsh attempt to sanitize public life, to hide away the inconvenient realities of poverty, disease, and injury. These laws reflected a deep-seated fear of imperfection and a misguided attempt to create an illusion of public order and health. When formal law failed or was simply absent, which was often the case, communities turned to vigilante justice. This wasn't just about impromptu lynch mobs or necktie parties, though those certainly happened, particularly for crimes like horse theft, which was considered one of the most heinous offences. Vigilantism could be a highly organised and ritualistic affair, a common form of punishment for lesser crimes, like cheating at cards or being a persistent public nuisance, was tarring and feathering. This was a brutal and humiliating public spectacle. A mob would seize the offender, strip them naked, and paint them with hot, sticky pine tar. Then, they would be covered in feathers, which would adhere to the tar, turning them into a monstrous bird-like figure. They would then be paraded through town on a rail, subjected to the jeers and ridicule of the entire community, before being dumped at the town limits and warned never to return. It was a punishment designed not just to cause pain, but to strip a person of their dignity and humanity. On the other hand, some of the most famous, lawless towns actually had surprisingly strict gun control. In places like Dodge City and Tombstone, visitors were required to check their firearms at the sheriff's office or a designated depository upon entering town limits. The romanticized image of cowboys walking into a saloon with six-shooters blazing is largely a myth. Most towns understood that a population armed to the teeth and lubricated with cheap whiskey was a recipe for disaster. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral was in fact sparked by the Earp brothers trying to enforce Tombstone's ordinance against carrying weapons in town. The law in the West was a strange patchwork of formal statutes, brutal mob justice, and practical regulations, all designed to impose some semblance of order on a fundamentally chaotic world. If you think modern food trends are strange, you haven't seen anything yet. The diet of the Wild West was a testament to human ingenuity in the face of extreme scarcity. People cooked and ate things that would make most of us recoil, not because they had strange tastes, but because they had no other choice. It was a cuisine of desperation, resourcefulness, and occasionally, accidental poisoning. Imagine you're a homesteader on the vast, treeless prairie. It's been months since you've seen fresh fruit. Your sweet tooth is aching. What do? You make a pie. But without apples, cherries, or berries, you have to get creative. This gave rise to a whole category of desperation pies. One of the most peculiar was the vinegar pie. It sounds unappetizing, but it was a clever substitute for lemon meringue. The filling was a simple custard, made from eggs, sugar, butter, and a splash of apple cider vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruit. Baked in a simple crust, it was surprisingly tasty, a sweet and sour treat in a world of blandness. There was also the mock apple pie, where the filling was made not with apples, but with crushed crackers, water, sugar, and spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. The crackers would soften during baking, taking on a texture remarkably similar to cooked apples. But the frontier diet wasn't all clever substitutions. It also involved eating things that were simply available. Small game was a staple. While deer and bison were prized, they weren't always accessible. So, people ate what they could catch. Squirrels were common, often stewed in a dish called squirrel mulligan. Rattlesnake was another source of protein, with many claiming it tasted like chicken. And then there were the prairie dogs. These burrowing rodents were plentiful, and while some saw them as pests, others saw them as a walking pantry. They were often roasted over an open fire. This brings us to one of the West's most famous and misunderstood culinary terms: prairie oysters. This was not a dish from the sea, it was a euphemism for bull testicles. During cattle roundups in the spring, calves were castrated. Rather than let the removed organs go to waste, cowboys would gather them up, peel off the outer membrane, slice them, and fry them in a hot skillet over the campfire. It was a practical, no-waste tradition. Seasoned with a little salt and pepper, they were considered a delicacy, a special treat for the hard-working cowboys on the trail. Eating them was a mark of a seasoned hand, not for the faint of heart. Food preservation was another area of strange and sometimes dangerous practices. Without refrigeration, meat was salted, smoked, or dried into jerky. But other chemicals were also used. Borax, a mineral compound we now use in cleaning products, was commonly used as a food preservative. A sprinkle of borax on meat could keep it from spoiling, but it also had toxic side effects if consumed in large quantities. Similarly, formaldehyde was sometimes used to keep milk fresh for longer. People were often unknowingly consuming a cocktail of chemicals with their daily meals. The free lunch in saloons, as we mentioned, was a salty trap. But even home cooking had its perils. Flour was often gritty with sand or dirt from the milling process. Canned goods, a new and exciting technology, were sealed with lead solder, which could leach into the food, leading to slow lead poisoning. In the Wild West, every meal was a small act of faith. Faith that your food wasn't spoiled, that it wouldn't make you sick, and that you'd have enough to get you through to the next day. In a world before the FDA, before Netflix, and before reliable entertainment, one of the strangest and most beloved events in a small frontier town was the arrival of the medicine show. This wasn't just a man selling tonics from the back of a wagon. It was a full-blown spectacle, a traveling circus of music, magic, and medical misinformation that offered a thrilling escape from the drudgery of daily life. Imagine your town has been quiet for weeks. Suddenly, a brightly painted wagon rolls down the main street, pulled by horses adorned with ribbons. A charismatic professor or doctor, with a booming voice and a magnificent moustache, steps onto a makeshift stage. He's flanked by assistants, perhaps a pretty girl who can sing, a musician with a banjo, or even a performer in stereotypical Native American garb to lend an air of ancient wisdom to the proceedings. For the next few hours, the town is captivated. The show might feature a fire eater, a juggler, a comedian telling corny jokes, or a dramatic skit. The banjo player strums lively tunes. The professor might perform feats of magic or hypnotism. All of this was designed to do one thing: draw a crowd and build trust. This was the entertainment portion, free for all to enjoy. Then came the main event, the sales pitch. The professor would launch into a passionate speech about the miracle product he was offering. It might be a tonic, a balm, a liniment, or a packet of electric powders. He'd hold up a bottle of murky liquid and declare it a cure for all that ails you. Rheumatism, gout, liver complaints, nervous tension, female troubles, baldness, laziness. His elixir could conquer them all. To prove its power, he'd often use a shill from the audience, a secret accomplice who would limp onto the stage, take a swig of the tonic, and suddenly leap into the air, cured and full of vigor. The crowd would gasp. Testimonials would be read from supposedly satisfied customers across the country. The professor might even perform a painless tooth extraction on a brave volunteer, using a combination of sleight of hand and a potent, numbing, narcotic-laced liquid. The appeal was irresistible. In a world of real pain and few real cures, the medicine show offered a glimmer of hope, wrapped in a package of dazzling entertainment. People lined up to buy the bottles, handing over their hard-earned cash for a chance at a miracle. Of course, it was all a scam. The performers were actors, the testimonials were fake, and the medicine was, as we've discussed, mostly alcohol, opium, or other narcotics. It didn't cure diseases, but it did provide a temporary, blissful escape from pain and anxiety. The medicine show was a uniquely Western form of theatre, a strange blend of commerce, entertainment, and deception. It preyed on the hopes of the desperate, but it also brought a rare night of colour, laughter, and wonder to isolated communities that were starved for it. The professor was a quack and a con man, but for one night, under the stars, he was also the most exciting thing to ever happen to your town. Beyond the travelling medicine show, entertainment on the frontier was a raw, creative, and often violent affair. With no electricity, no movie theatres, and no professional sports leagues, people had to make their own fun, and their idea of a good time could be peculiar and brutal. For cowboys with time to kill between cattle drives, entertainment often involved testing their machismo in dangerous and cruel games. One of the most infamous was gander pulling. A live gander, or goose, would have its neck greased and would be hung upside down from a tree branch or a rope strung across a road. Cowboys would then ride past at a full gallop, trying to grab the gander's head and pull it off. The winner was the one who succeeded. It was a bloody, chaotic spectacle that was as much about horsemanship and strength as it was about sheer brutality. Another strange pastime was wrestling, but not just man against man. Sometimes, a man would wrestle a bear. A travelling showman might arrive in town with a muzzled and sometimes declawed black bear, and local toughs would pay for the chance to grapple with the animal in a makeshift ring. It was a stunning display of the era's different attitude toward animal welfare and a testament to the lengths men would go to prove their strength. For the less bloodthirsty, there were community events like barn dances, spelling bees, and surprisingly popular theatrical performances. Travelling troupes of actors would perform melodramas in town halls or even on saloon stages. These plays had simple, exaggerated plots. A virtuous heroine tied to the railroad tracks, a dastardly villain with a handlebar mustache, and a handsome hero who always arrived just in time. The audience participation was enthusiastic and rowdy. People would cheer for the hero, hiss and throw rotten vegetables at the villain, and weep for the damsel in distress. It was interactive theatre, at its most chaotic. Even early sports were different. A game of baseball on the frontier bore little resemblance to the modern sport. It was often played with handmade balls and bats, on fields with no fences, and with rules that varied from town to town. Fights were common, and the game was as much a social brawl as an athletic contest. Boxing, or pugilism, was also popular, but these were bare-knuckle affairs with no gloves, no rounds, and no referee to stop the fight. A match continued until one man could no longer stand. These events, though violent, were vital social glue. They brought communities together, provided a release from the endless hard work, and offered a chance to forge a collective identity in a world that was often lonely and isolating. The hardships of the West were not just physical. The vast, empty landscapes, the profound isolation, and the constant struggle for survival took a heavy toll on the human mind. Settlers battled not just droughts and blizzards, but also a deep, creeping loneliness that could lead to strange behaviors, unshakable superstitions, and a fragile grasp on reality itself. Imagine you are a woman who has left her family and friends back east, to follow your husband to a homestead in the middle of Nebraska or the Dakotas. Your new home is a sod house, a dark, damp dwelling built from bricks of turf. Your nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, a distance you might only cross a few times a year. Your husband is out in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Your only companions are your small children and the relentless, howling wind. The landscape is a flat, featureless ocean of grass that stretches to the horizon in every direction. There are no trees to break the monotony, no hills to climb. The sky is immense, oppressive. The silence is deafening, broken only by the wind's constant moan. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. You see no new faces. You hear no new stories. This was the reality for thousands of settlers, and it gave rise to a poorly understood but widely reported phenomenon known as prairie madness. It wasn't a formal medical diagnosis, but a folk term for the profound depression, anxiety, and sometimes psychosis that afflicted those living in extreme isolation. The symptoms varied. Some people became withdrawn and melancholic, falling into a deep, listless despair. They would sit for hours, staring blankly at the wall, unable to work or care for their families. Others became agitated and prone to fits of weeping or violent rage. The constant wind was often cited as a trigger, a sound that, over time, could drive a person to distraction. Stories were told of women who couldn't stop cleaning, scrubbing the dirt floors of their sod houses over and over again, as if trying to impose some order on a chaotic and indifferent world. In the most extreme cases, prairie madness led to suicide or violence. A settler might simply walk out into a blizzard, never to be seen again. A mother, driven to despair by the crying of her children and the crushing loneliness, might harm them or herself. These were tragic, whispered stories, the dark side of the hopeful homesteading dream. To combat this creeping madness, people developed strange and desperate coping mechanisms. They would talk to their livestock, to themselves, to the empty sky. Music was a lifeline. A family with a fiddle or a harmonica was considered blessed. They would play for hours in the evening, the simple tunes, a shield against the overwhelming silence. Storytelling and reading aloud from the Bible or a worn-out novel were other ways to fill the emptiness. The rare visit from a neighbor became a monumental event, a precious chance for human contact that could sustain a person for weeks. The arrival of a traveling peddler or a circuit-riding preacher was cause for celebration. These moments were a reminder that a wider world still existed beyond the suffocating horizon. Prairie madness was a testament to the fact that humans are social creatures. The West might have offered land and opportunity, but it often did so at the cost of the one thing the soul needs most: connection. In a society saturated with death from disease, accidents, childbirth, and the lingering trauma of the Civil War, it's no surprise that many people became obsessed with what lay beyond the grave. This fascination gave rise to one of the 19th century's strangest and most popular movements: spiritualism. Spiritualism was the belief that the living could communicate with the spirits of the dead, usually through a gifted individual known as a medium. This wasn't a fringe cult. It was a widespread belief system that cut across social classes, attracting both grieving farm families and educated city dwellers. Imagine you've lost a husband in a mining accident or a child to scarlet fever. The grief is a physical weight, and the silence they've left behind is unbearable. Then you hear of a medium who can contact the spirit world. You attend a séance, a gathering held in a darkened parlor. You sit around a table, holding hands with strangers, your heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The medium, often a woman, enters a trance-like state. The room grows cold. You might hear strange rapping sounds coming from the walls or the table. The table might levitate or tilt on its own. A disembodied voice might whisper from a dark corner. These were all common tricks of the trade, achieved with hidden strings, secret compartments, and skilled assistants. But to the hopeful and the grieving, they were proof of contact. The medium might claim to channel your deceased loved one, delivering a personal message: "I am happy here. Do not weep for me." She might produce spirit writing on a slate tablet or even spirit photographs, which showed the ghostly, superimposed image of a deceased person hovering near a living relative. This desire to connect with the dead was particularly strong in the West. Isolation made grief even harder to bear. Families were often far from the support of their extended kin, left to mourn alone. The séance offered not just comfort but a sense of community, a shared experience of loss and wonder. Furthermore, the West was seen as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Native American beliefs about the spirit world, though often misunderstood, blended with Christian ideas and folk superstitions to create a uniquely American form of mysticism. Of course, the movement was filled with charlatans. Mediums were frequently exposed as frauds, using clever illusions to prey on the vulnerable. But for every exposure, there were thousands of believers who clung to the hope that their loved ones were not truly gone, but simply waiting on the other side, ready to whisper a message of comfort across the Great Divide. Spiritualism was more than just a strange belief. It was a profound emotional response to a world defined by uncertainty, loss, and the ever-present reality of death. As we draw the curtain on this journey through the forgotten corners of the Wild West, a single truth emerges from the dust. The strange things people did, the communal bathing, the vinegar pies, the hair jewelry, the ugly laws were not born of madness or ignorance. They were born of necessity. They were the logical, ingenious, and sometimes desperate adaptations of a people pushed to their absolute limits. The Hollywood version of the West gives us a world of simple morality, of clear-eyed heroes and black-hearted villains. The reality was a far messier, more complex and infinitely stranger place. It was a world where grime could be a form of armor, where a toothache could kill you, where a love letter could be an insult, and where hope could be purchased from a con man in a colorful wagon. These practices reveal the profound resilience of the human spirit. They show us that when faced with isolation, people will create their own forms of community. When faced with scarcity, they will invent new ways to find joy and sustenance. And when faced with overwhelming grief, they will build bridges to the world of the dead, whether real or imagined. The men and women of the American West were not the stoic, silent figures of legend. They were complex individuals who lived, loved, laughed, and suffered in a world that demanded constant reinvention. Their strangeness is not something to be mocked or dismissed. It is a testament to their creativity, their endurance, and their stubborn refusal to be broken by a land that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. They remind us that what seems bizarre from the comfortable distance of history was, for them, simply another day in the struggle for life. Their world is gone, but the echoes of their strange and courageous lives remain, a quiet lesson in what it truly means to survive.